Wesley sits quietly in the garden each evening, his journal open, as he watches the world settle into peaceful rhythm. The soft scent of jasmine and the gentle breeze draw him deeper into the quiet moments that feel like small rituals. As he observes others around him, the listener is drawn into a tender world where stories are shared like meals, and each gentle interaction builds a quiet understanding that feels both safe and deeply human. First light in the garden. Wesley sat on the wooden bench, his journal open against his thigh, the pages fluttering softly in the evening breeze. The leather binding was worn smooth from years of use, and he had learned to let the wind turn the pages at their own pace. He had come to the garden every evening for 3 weeks now, drawn by the gentle rhythm of the place. Tonight his pencil hovered over the sketch of the garden's layout, capturing the curves of the stone pathways and the way morning light pooled in the corners where the night-bloom scent trees bloomed. The wind shifted, and a soft whisper of fragrance brushed against his nose, a scent that had nothing to do with the garden's usual perfume of roses and lavender. It was sharp, almost electric, as if the air itself were trying to say something. Wesley didn't look up immediately. He wasn't sure he wanted to hear what it was trying to say. His fingers tightened on the pencil, and he felt the familiar weight of doubt settle into his chest, like a stone dropped into still water. He turned the page carefully, the sound of rustling paper barely audible in the stillness. The journal was full of fragments, bits of conversation, moments that lingered like after-images in a dream. He'd scribbled a few lines about Sophia's eyes, how they had looked like she was holding something back. There was a note in the margin from last week, a quote he'd heard from Raya, something about the spaces between words. He'd tried to transcribe it, but the words had slipped from his mind like water from cupped hands. He flipped another page, the breeze now picking up slightly, rustling the pages like fingers brushing against skin. The scent of night bloom was stronger now, almost overwhelming. He blinked, trying to push the sensation aside, but it clung to him like a memory he couldn't quite recall. A memory of his mother, maybe, or a dream he'd never spoken of. Wesley sighed, and the sound seemed to echo in the empty air around him. He was used to silence, but lately the silence felt louder than the noise. The garden wasn't quiet, not really. There was the soft murmur of water somewhere in the distance, a distant humming that reminded him of a lullaby his father had once hummed to him as a boy. But the wind carried something else too, a whisper, barely a whisper, but it made his skin prickle. He looked up, scanning the garden. Sophia stood at the edge, her silhouette outlined against the fading light. Her hands were folded tightly in front of her, and she was staring at the night-bloom scent trees as if she were trying to read their secrets. Wesley wondered if she knew he'd noticed. She always seemed to notice him, even when she didn't look at him. Not alone, he murmured to himself, half joking, but there was something else, something deeper, in the way he said it. He was trying to believe it, even though he didn't know who he was trying to convince. Sophia stood at the edge of the garden, watching the others gather. She had been the last to arrive, her eyes fixed on the night-bloom scent trees that swayed in the wind like they were trying to tell her something. The scent was potent, almost too much, but it made her think of her grandmother's kitchen, where spices were more than flavor, but memory. She felt the familiar weight of her mother's recipe book in her bag, but she hadn't opened it yet. There was something about this garden that felt like a promise, not just of food or stories, but of acceptance. The scent of the night-bloom trees hit her like a wave. She had never been one to seek out fragrances, but there was something hypnotic about their perfume, like a secret passed in hushed tones. Her breath hitched slightly as it hit her, and she closed her eyes, letting the memory of her grandmother's kitchen wash over her. The kitchen was warm, always warm, with a scent that lingered on her hands and her clothes. She remembered the way her grandmother would move, always gentle, always careful, like she was tending to something fragile and precious. A small smile tugged at the corner of her mouth, but it didn't last. She opened her eyes again, glancing around the garden, her heart skipping a beat when she saw Raya leaning against the stone wall. The older woman's eyes were closed, and her hands were still, resting on her chest. Sophia had noticed that Raya's voice had grown softer with age, but she still had a way of speaking without words. Sophia had never known how to respond to that, never knew what it meant when Raya looked at her with those tired, knowing eyes. She fixed on the night-bloom trees again, and the scent was stronger now, almost too much. It made her feel light-headed, like the air around her was beginning to shift. Her hands trembled slightly as she reached into her bag, fingers brushing over the recipe book. She didn't know why she had brought it. She didn't know why she hadn't opened it yet. But something in the garden made her feel like she was supposed to. Raya leaned against a stone wall, eyes closed as she listened to the distant sound of water. Her hands lay still on her chest, fingertips tracing the slow beat of her own heartbeat. She had lived here all her life, and the garden had always been her sanctuary, a place where time moved slower and stories were made. Her voice had grown softer with age, but she still knew how to listen, how to hear what others didn't say. The water was distant, but it was a constant presence, like a whisper from the past. She remembered the sound of the old fountain from her childhood, how it had been cracked and broken, but still made a sound that had carried with it the memory of her mother's voice, a voice that had told her stories when she couldn't sleep. She remembered how her mother had used to say, "Listen closely, child, and you'll hear the stories that the world doesn't tell you." She opened her eyes slowly, the light from the garden making her squint. There was movement in the distance. Someone was walking toward the fountain. She couldn't tell who it was, but she felt it, like a shift in the air itself. She stayed still, her body tense, waiting. The water was a constant reminder of the past. The garden had always been a place of memory, of stories that could be told or forgotten. But she had always known that some things were meant to be kept alive, even if they were buried under years of silence. Vikram quietly arranged the chairs near the night bloom scent trees, each one placed just so, as if he were creating a meditation. He was the one who had suggested the garden gatherings, the one who had started the tradition of storytelling and sharing meals. He had been the quietest of the group, but his presence was always felt, like a thread that kept them all connected. He moved with deliberate care, each chair placed with the precision of a person who understood the power of ritual. There was something almost sacred in the way he arranged them, the way they caught the light, how they were spaced to allow for conversation and silence alike. His hands were steady, but his eyes were sharp, scanning the garden as if he were watching for something. He had always believed that the garden was more than just a place. It was a place where stories lived, where memories took shape, and where people could find what they had lost. He had started the gatherings not because he needed them, but because he understood how important it was to create space for others to breathe. He didn't talk much, but when he did, it was always with a carefulness that made people listen. He glanced over his shoulder, watching the others begin to settle in. Sophia was still standing by the edge, and Amara was sketching something in the corner. Rafaela was strumming a melody on her guitar, the notes soft and haunting. He smiled slightly, feeling the weight of connection that seemed to hold them all together. This was what he had hoped for. Amara sat cross-legged on a moss-covered stone, sketching the garden's layout with delicate strokes. Her pencil moved like a gentle wave, capturing not just the lines, but the softness of light that danced through the trees. The garden was a living thing to her, a canvas of emotion that she could read in the way the shadows fell across the ground. She had always drawn with her heart, never with her head. Every line was a memory, every shade a feeling. She watched the garden with the same eyes she had always used, searching for the truth in the way the light fell on the stones and how it pooled in the hollows between them. The garden wasn't just a place, it was a feeling, and she was trying to capture that feeling in her sketch, to hold it in a moment, so it would never fade. She paused, the pencil hovering over the page, and looked up at the night bloom scent trees. The scent was strong now, and she could feel it in her lungs, in her bones. It was a scent of memory, of connection, of something she didn't want to let go of. She closed her eyes and breathed deeply, trying to hold it. She had always felt that the garden was watching her, that it was a living, breathing thing, and she had always been its observer, its keeper of the quiet moments. She didn't speak often, but she listened, and the garden had taught her how to listen in a way that went beyond words. Rafaela strummed a gentle melody on her guitar, the notes blending into the evening air. She had brought it from her old apartment, the one she hadn't quite managed to leave behind. The guitar had become a part of her, like a memory that wouldn't fade. She played softly, not for anyone in particular, just because it felt right. She had always found music in silence, in the spaces between notes. She had started playing when she was young, when she felt like she had lost the right to speak, when the words in her head were too loud and too dangerous. She had learned that music could say things that words couldn't, things that needed to be held, not shouted. She had moved to this garden after a long silence, after the world had become too much. She had needed a place where she could breathe, where she could remember what it was like to feel something, even if it was just the quiet, gentle sound of wind through leaves. She played a melody that had come to her in a dream, a tune she had never heard before but knew by heart. The notes were soft, like whispers, and they seemed to reach out to everyone in the garden, touching them in a way that made them pause and listen. Zainab checked her tablet, glancing at the group with quiet curiosity. Her fingers hovered over the screen but didn't press any keys. She had always been someone who preferred solitude, but the garden had made her feel strangely unsettled. It wasn't the warmth, it was the connection. The way everyone looked at each other, like they were part of something bigger. She had come to the garden because of the light, because of the way it played across the leaves. She had needed a place to think, to process, to remember. But it was the people that surprised her. There was a comfort in the way they gathered, as if they had always belonged here. She had never felt that way before, and it scared her. She closed her eyes, trying to quiet the noise in her head. The garden was a place where thoughts could be held, where silence could speak louder than words. But she didn't know if she was ready for that. Not yet. She studied the night bloom scent trees again, watching as they swayed in the wind. The scent was strong now, and it made her feel like she was being called to something. But she didn't know what. She had always been someone who stayed in the background, who watched and waited. But now she couldn't help but wonder if she was supposed to be part of the story. Sanaa stood at the edge of the garden, clutching her prayer beads and observing. She had arrived with a heavy heart, the weight of displacement pressing down on her. Her family had been torn apart by war, and she had been forced to start over. But here, in this garden, something felt like it might be salvageable. The scent of the night bloom trees was overwhelming. It reminded her of home, of the smell of her grandmother's prayers, of the way the air had always been thick with the scent of incense and hope. She closed her eyes and tried to quiet the memory of war, of the sound of bombs and the way her family had scattered. But the garden held her, somehow, like it understood her pain, like it was trying to offer her something. She felt the weight of her beads in her hand, the smooth stones worn by countless fingers, the way they had once been blessed by her grandmother's touch. She had never let go of them, never let them fall to the ground. They were her anchor, her prayer, her connection to what was real in a world that had become too much. She opened her eyes again, looking at the garden with a mixture of sadness and hope. The garden was still, but it was alive, like a place that was always waiting for something to happen. And maybe, she thought, maybe it was waiting for her. The golden light touched a night bloom scent petal, sending a shimmer through the air. Wesley's eyes followed the movement, his pencil hesitating for a moment before he added another sketch. He had come to the garden to tell stories, but it felt like he was learning how to listen. The light caught the petal just right, and for a moment the garden was bathed in a golden glow. The air shimmered with it, like heat rising from the earth. Wesley blinked, and when he looked again it was gone, but he could still feel the warmth of the light in his chest. He flipped through his journal, marking a page with a small note. The words were written in his neat script, the kind that looked like it had been written in the rain. He had always found comfort in words, in the way they could carry something important without needing to say it out loud. The pages of his journal were full of fragments of conversation, notes from the garden, stories he had heard but not yet told. He turned to a page where he had written about Sophia, about the way her eyes changed when she was thinking. He had always found her mysterious, even in the moments when she spoke. She was like a puzzle he was never quite solving, a mystery that kept him curious. He flipped to another page where he had scribbled a note from Raya. "You're not alone, even when you think you are." It was simple, but it stayed with him. He didn't know what it meant, not yet. But he had a feeling that the garden would show him. Sophia's eyes caught the light, reflecting a memory of her grandmother's kitchen. She had been so young when she had first sat at that table, her hands stained with the spices her grandmother had taught her to love. She closed her eyes and breathed in the scent of night bloom scent, trying to remember the taste of her grandmother's tamarind chutney. The scent was strong now, and it took her back. She was younger then, smaller, and everything had felt more certain. She remembered the way her grandmother would smile when she asked for more, the way she would say, "You'll remember this, child, because it's more than just a recipe, it's a memory." She opened her eyes again, feeling the weight of the garden settling on her shoulders. It was more than just a place. It was a place where memories lived, where stories were born. She had always been someone who had lived in the past, but now she felt like she was being pulled forward, like the garden was calling her to something more. The last beat ended with Wesley hearing a soft whisper from Raya, who said, "You're not alone, even when you think you are." The words were barely more than a breath, but they hit Wesley like a stone dropped into a still lake. He looked up, his eyes searching the garden, and saw Raya's face, calm and knowing, her lips parting as if to say more. But she didn't. Wesley closed his eyes, and for a moment he felt the weight of everything he had been holding in silence. And he realized, suddenly, that he had never really been alone. Not really. The scent of sharing. The scent of cardamom and cinnamon drifted from Sophia's hands like a prayer. She stirred the mixture with deliberate care, spices releasing their warmth into the air. Wesley watched from the corner of his journal, the story of a child's first festival already half forgotten. The night bloom trees stood silent, petals shimmering with golden light. "It's not just a recipe," Sophia murmured, voice low and certain. "It's a memory." Her fingers trembled slightly as she added a final pinch of cinnamon. The scent hit him like a wave. Her grandmother's kitchen, tamarind chutney, morning tea. Wesley felt his chest tighten. He hadn't smelled such a thing in years, so much more than comfort. He looked down at his hands, at the pages where he'd scribbled fragments of conversation, and realized he'd never written about the way Sophia's eyes looked when she cooked. That was something to carry. Raya's voice rose softly from the center of the garden, weaving a story about a lost bird. The children clustered around her, faces lit by firelight flickering between tables. Her voice made it seem like the tale was unfolding and receding in her mind at once. Wesley's pencil hovered over paper, catching up to a memory, his grandmother's story about people disappearing into each other's tales, becoming the characters they once were. "You're not alone, even when you think you are," Raya said, and it echoed in his mind like a bell rung in the wind. Vikram sat quietly with the elders, drawing them into a circle. He had a gift for coaxing delicate memories from those who kept them hidden. "Tell me about the first festival you remember," he said gently, and the old woman smiled, eyes brightening. "I was 7, she said. My grandmother told me the wind carried stories from one world to another. I believed it." A hush fell, and Wesley felt that quiet thread of connection binding them, even if they had never said it aloud. He studied his journal again, writing in the margins, "The wind carries stories. The wind carries us." Amara's sketchbook lay open on her lap, her pencil dancing over paper. She had watched the evening with practiced eyes, catching light like a lens. She drew Sophia's hands, Raya's voice, the firelight on children's faces. There were quiet smiles, slight turns of the head, the way people listened with their whole bodies. These were moments that needed to be seen, to be held. She paused to observe a silent exchange between elders, then began again, carefully capturing how the wind moved through the trees. Rafaela hummed a soft tune as she moved between chairs, guitar tucked under her arm. The melody was simple but heavy with meaning. She passed by Wesley's corner, her eyes catching his for a moment, and he felt a flutter in his chest. She was the one who had started the evening, her voice and guitar bringing the garden to life. She had asked for a moment of silence, a moment of peace, and now the garden was full of it. The air was thick with the scent of night bloom petals, soft sounds of laughter and conversation, gentle memories. The garden was alive, breathing with them. Zainab sat silently, scanning the layout of the garden, methodical, taking notes with calm efficiency. Her fingers moved over her tablet, marking locations and angles. She hadn't joined the storytellers, nor shared in the meal. She had arrived to observe, not participate. But as the evening wore on, her hand moved less, and her attention drifted more often to the faces around her. She noticed how the children gathered around Raya, how Sophia's hands shook slightly while preparing the cardamom mixture, how the wind had shifted to bring the scent of the night bloom trees closer. Sanaa stepped forward with a small handbag of sweets, her movements careful and deliberate. She offered them to a young girl who had been watching her with wide eyes. The child's face lit up with surprise and delight. "Thank you," the girl whispered, and Sanaa smiled, a soft and genuine expression that surprised her. She had always been cautious, waited for the right moment, but tonight felt different. The garden had become a space where small gestures created ripples. Sanaa felt the weight of her act, and for the first time in a long while, she was not afraid. Sophia's hands paused over the mixture, her eyes closing as she listened to Raya's words. The story took root in her memory, like a seed planted in fertile soil. She heard her mother's voice, the way she had spoken of the festival, of food as a way of keeping people connected. The scent of cardamom filled her lungs, and she remembered standing in her grandmother's kitchen, small hands wrapped around a wooden spoon, learning to stir the mixture. Her mother's laughter echoed in the space, and she had felt whole, even if it was a whole just beginning to take shape. Sophia looked down at her hands, and for the first time in weeks, they did not tremble. Vikram gently placed a book on the table, its cover worn smooth from countless readings. A collection of local folk tales, stories passed down through generations. He selected one about a young woman who chose to stay in her village rather than leave for the city, even when the chance came. It was a story about choice, about staying connected to what was important. "The garden is a place where stories are shared," he said, "where the past meets the present." The others nodded, and Sophia's face lit up. She had heard the tale once from her grandmother. It had been one of the first stories that made her understand the meaning of home. Wesley hummed softly as he read from his journal. A gentle story about a child's first festival, the sounds of laughter and drums, the sweetness of sweets and scent of flowers. The story was not about him, but about the way stories could be shared, passed from one to another, the way they could heal. His voice was soft, a whisper that carried across the garden, and the others listened in silence. Raya's voice had faded into memory, but its echo remained. Wesley looked up to see Sophia standing next to him, hands still holding the bowl of cardamom mixture. Her face was calm, and he saw she was holding herself differently now, more open, more like someone who had found something in the garden she hadn't known she was looking for. "I'm not sure I'm ready to share everything yet," she whispered. "But I'm trying." The words felt like a promise, a small but important step forward. The night-bloom trees swayed gently in the breeze, their scent stronger now, carrying with it the weight of all the stories shared, all the small moments made sacred by the garden's embrace. Wesley looked down at his journal again, and in the margins he wrote, "The garden remembers, the garden shares, the garden heals." He closed his eyes, feeling the warmth of the light on his skin, the weight of stories told, and the ones yet to be told. Whispers of the past. The garden was quiet except for the night-bloom trees, their white petals trembling in the breeze like whispered secrets. Raya leaned forward, her weathered hands folding into her lap. She closed her eyes and began to speak, her voice carrying the weight of centuries in a gentle murmur that made everyone lean in closer. "Once upon a time," she began, "the moon was not a cold thing. It was a mother holding her children close with silver arms. But the children grew restless. They wanted to dance in the stars, to climb the sky with their own hands. So they asked the moon for permission, and she, being wise, said they could have it. But first they must listen to the stories that live in the spaces between light and shadow." Wesley felt his chest tighten. He knew that story. His grandmother had told it to him before the world grew too loud. He didn't think anyone else knew it, not really. Not in the way Raya was telling it now. He watched her mouth move, saw her eyes still closed but somehow seeing everything, and the weight of her memory pressed against his ribs. Sophia paused, her whisk still in the bowl of cardamom and sugar, her face softening. The story was calling something up in her, something buried under layers of hesitation and fear. She had never heard this version, but the words felt like home. "The children of the moon," Raya continued, her voice growing softer, "were not merely playful. They were hungry for stories. They wanted to know what it meant to be loved, to be seen, to be remembered. And so they would dance between the clouds, and with each step, a new story would be born." Vikram shifted slightly, his hands folded on his knees. He wanted to interrupt, to offer a correction, but something in Raya's rhythm held him still. Her words carried the same cadence as the old tales his own mother had shared, deep, full, and deliberate. Amara's pencil moved across the paper with quiet precision, sketching the shape of Raya's hands, the way they curved and folded with each pause. She could feel the moment building, the thread pulling all their attention into the space between past and present. Her sketch formed 3 figures, one older, one younger, one in between, told a story all its own. And when the children tired, they would return to the moon's arms, and she would hold them close, whispering the stories that would guide them in the dark, Raya said, her voice now barely more than a breath. But the stories would not stay with her. They would fall from her lips like starlight, and each one would take root in the hearts of those who listened. Wesley's hands tightened on the journal in his lap. He wanted to speak, to say something, but his voice felt trapped behind his chest. His eyes were fixed on Raya, watching as her words painted the air around them. He wanted to tell her he knew this tale. He wanted to tell her that he had heard it once, long ago, and how it had changed him. But he couldn't. Not yet. Rafaela hummed softly, a low melodic hum that matched the rhythm of the words. She didn't know the story, but she could feel its pull, how it drew them closer to one another, how it made them all sit still, waiting for the next line. It was a sound that filled the silence with something deeper, something older. Zainab glanced around the circle, her eyes catching the shape of each person's face. She wasn't listening, really, not in the way Sophia or Wesley or Rafaela were. She was observing the arrangement of the seating, ensuring that no one was out of place. A few loose stones had shifted in the grass, and she made a note to fix them later. But something about Raya's voice made her pause. She didn't know why, but it made her want to sit just a little bit closer. Sanaa had been watching the way Raya's hands moved, the way she gestured as she spoke. The elder woman's movements were calm, deliberate, like someone who knew what she was doing. It made Sanaya's heart clench. This was the kind of storytelling she'd always wanted to hear, the kind that made her feel seen. She smiled softly, just a flicker, and pressed her hand gently to her chest. "And so," Raya said, her voice now a whisper, "the moon learned to listen and to love the stories that came to her. She would let the children dance, but she would not forget them. They were her children after all, and in the quiet moments between their steps, she would teach them the names of the stars." The garden fell silent after that. The wind had died down, and the scent of night bloom filled the air. Wesley felt his chest ache. He watched the others. Their faces were all turned toward Raya, and he realized they were all holding their breath. The story was ending, but it felt like the beginning of something else entirely. "Tell me yours next, Wesley," Raya said, her eyes still closed. "I've been waiting for your story." Wesley's breath caught. The words were not a question, but a gentle demand. He looked down at his hands, the journal still clutched in his lap. He had never shared a story from his own life with them. It felt impossible, too personal, too raw. But something in Raya's voice, something in the way she studied him, made him want to speak. He began, his voice soft and uncertain. "There was a festival once, not like the ones in the stories, not one that made it into the books. It was just a quiet celebration in a small village after a hard winter." He paused, his fingers tracing the edge of the journal. The memory was faint, like a dream that half remembered. But it was real, and he could feel it pulling at him now. "We didn't have much, but we had each other. The festival was held in the center of town, and everyone came. Even the old men who never talked much, even the children who were shy. We shared food and stories, and we danced under the stars." Wesley's voice was low, and it seemed to fill the air around them. He could see the others leaning in, listening, and the way their eyes followed his words. It was strange hearing his own voice in this context, the way it felt different when it wasn't just in his head. "I was maybe 10, and I was the one who had to organize the games. My grandmother helped me, but I was scared. I didn't want to make mistakes or disappoint anyone. We had the traditional games, ring toss, and a race with a ball, and a contest where we had to tell a story that would make people laugh." He paused again. It was hard to say this out loud. To let them hear it, to let them know that even in that small village he had been learning to open up, even if it hadn't felt like it at the time. "We had a runner who was slow, but he was the best at storytelling. He would tell stories that made everyone laugh, and he would tell them so well that even the shy kids would come out of their shells. I thought he was magic, just because he could make people laugh." Wesley's voice was soft now, almost in a whisper. He looked up and saw Raya's eyes open, fixed on him. "And then there was a moment," he continued, his voice growing stronger, "when he told us a story about how he had almost forgotten to tell his own mother that he loved her, how he had almost missed the chance to say it. He said it was a mistake to wait until the last minute, to wait until it was too late." The words came with a kind of weight, and Wesley felt his eyes sting a little. He was surprised by how much it hurt to remember. But it was not sadness, it was warmth. "After that story, we all sat in silence for a while. We didn't need to say anything else. We had all heard it, and we knew what it meant. That's when I started to understand that stories don't have to be big to be powerful. They can be small, and they can be real." Wesley stopped, his gaze falling to his hands. He had never told anyone that story before. He had never shared it with anyone, even his own grandmother. But here, in the garden, with the moonlight soft on his face, with Raya and Sophia and the others watching him, he felt something shift. He felt seen. Raya smiled, and her hand moved to her chest. "Your story was a gift," she said softly. "And now I will tell you a little more." She closed her eyes again, and the garden settled into stillness, waiting. The air smelled of night bloom scent and earth, and Wesley felt something in him finally begin to open. "The moon had many children, but not all of them stayed with her," she said, her voice now a quiet murmur. "Some left to explore, some to forget, some to grow. But each one carried a piece of her voice, a piece of her memory. And so the stars became the storytellers, the light, the names of places forgotten and remembered." As she spoke, Wesley watched the others, and he saw something in their faces that hadn't been there before. They were listening, not just to the story, but to each other, to the way the past and present met in the space between them. And he knew, with a sudden certainty, that this was what he had always been looking for. He studied Raya one more time, and her eyes were still closed. Her smile was soft, and in that moment he realized that he had not been alone. Not really. The wind picked up slightly, and the night bloom trees rustled again. Raya's voice drifted on the breeze, and Wesley felt himself smiling. Not a smile of joy, but one of understanding. He had heard something he'd never heard before, and he knew, with a quiet certainty, that it was just the beginning. The garden was full of stories now, and it was safe to be a part of them. A taste of home. The scent of cardamom curled through the garden like a whispered promise, wrapping around the wooden tables and settling into the earth beneath their feet. Sophia stood at the small stove, her hands moving with practiced ease as she stirred a pot of dal that would soon be ladled into bowls. The spices, cumin, coriander, turmeric, released their secrets in the heat, each one calling to her memory. She closed her eyes and let the familiar warmth of the process wash over her. It was how her grandmother had made it, in a kitchen that had been torn down years ago but still lived on in her hands. Wesley sat on the edge of the bench, his notebook resting open on his knees. He was listening, not just to Sophia, but to the rhythm of her movements, the way her fingers moved with the precision of one who had never forgotten the shape of a recipe. She was cooking, but she was also remembering, and he found himself drawn into that space between present and past. "My grandmother used to say that every dish held a memory," Sophia said, not turning to look at him. Her voice was soft, but it carried the weight of something sacred. "When you cook with love, the love doesn't just stay in the food, it stays with those who eat it." Wesley's chest tightened. It was a sentiment he had heard before, but it felt different when it came from Sophia, from her hands, from the way she moved through the air like she was carrying something delicate. "It was a tradition that felt sacred," she continued, "but also something I was afraid to pass on. When I moved here, I was afraid I would lose the taste of home, that the recipes would become hollow without the hands that knew how to make them." She lifted her hand to her chest, touching the place where her heart lived. "But then I realized, it isn't about the hands that make it. It's about the love that is in the hands that take it." Raya was watching her, her eyes warm with understanding. She leaned forward, and Wesley noticed how her fingers moved to the edge of the table, as if to reach out, but not quite. "I think we all have that fear," Raya said, her voice gentle. "That we'll lose something, or that we'll forget how to make it again. But it's not forgotten, just waiting to be remembered." Sophia's smile was slow, like a flower unfurling in morning light. "It's like the stories we tell. We don't lose them, we just find new ways to say them." The moment was still between them, unspoken but full. Wesley looked down at his notebook, where he had been writing the scent of cardamom, the way Sophia's fingers curved around the spoon, the way her hair caught the light from the lanterns. "So tell me," he said, voice soft and careful, "what is this dish? What does it mean?" Sophia paused, stirring the dal one more time. When she spoke, her words were calm, but there was something in her voice that made Wesley lean in, as if he were listening to the edge of something important. "It's called Sophia's dal," she said, "but it was actually my grandmother's. It's the recipe she used to make for the family after my grandfather died. She said that he could still be with us, in the taste of the food, in the way we sat around the table and talked about the day." She turned then, her eyes catching the lantern light. "It's a dish for remembering, for feeling the presence of those we love. It's not just about the ingredients, it's about the intention behind them." Vikram had been quietly arranging the seating, moving a small chair into the center of the circle, as if to symbolize the importance of belonging. Now he looked up at Sophia, his expression thoughtful. "I think," he said, "we all carry that kind of dish in us. Not just the ones that taste good, but the ones that carry stories." Sophia nodded, then gestured to the table where the food was beginning to steam. "Come, everyone, taste it, and let the memory of it remind us how much we've all shared." The bowl was passed around, the spoon dipped into the warm dal and brought to the lips. The first bite was shared between Sophia and Amara, both smiling, both tasting the essence of memory. Amara's sketchbook lay open beside her, but her eyes were fixed on Sophia's face. She drew quietly, the pencil moving in soft, careful strokes, capturing the way Sophia's smile curved as the dish touched her tongue. The laughter began with Rafaela, who hummed a tune from the beginning of the evening, her voice soft but carrying through the garden. "It's like we are all in the same dream," she said, her voice like a thread weaving through the air. "A dream of food and love, of belonging to something larger than ourselves." Zainab, who had been quietly observing the way the food was served, suddenly turned her gaze from her tablet. She set it down and looked at Sophia with a slight tilt of her head. "This is beautiful," she said, her voice even and calm, but her eyes were different, more open, more present. "I've seen many people who cook for the sake of taste, but you cook with intention. It makes a difference." Sophia blinked, surprised. She had never been called beautiful before, not in the way Zainab said it, not in a way that made her feel seen. "Thank you," she said, her voice small but full. Sana'a watched quietly from the edge of the table, her hands folded in her lap. She had taken a small bite and now sat still, tasting not just the dal, but the way the others smiled at each other, the way they were all drawn to the same warmth. Wesley reached for a small piece of laddu, a sweet that Sophia had made with coconut and jaggery, and he smiled at the taste. It was warm, rich, and familiar, like a story that had been told so many times it had become part of his soul. "This is the kind of food that remembers us," he said, looking up at Sophia with eyes that were soft with recognition. She looked down, her hand on her heart, and for a moment the garden was still. "This is not just food," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "It's love shared." A small child giggled nearby, and Sophia's face lit up. She turned, her eyes bright with joy, as the child took another bite of her ladoo. The moment was so perfect, so complete, that Wesley felt something shift inside him, like the weight of a long-held secret had finally been allowed to breathe. Raya leaned forward, her voice hushed but sure. "You've told us a part of the story," she said, "but I think it's time for someone else to share." And so, the night continued, the garden filled with the warmth of shared food, shared memory, and shared stories, each one a thread in a tapestry that was still being woven, still being made. They were all part of it, and that was enough. The lanterns flickered, the night bloom scent rose, and the garden held them all together in a gentle embrace that went beyond the physical. The meal was more than just food. It was a ceremony, a continuation, a reminder that love is never truly lost, only waiting to be found again. The weight of memory. The lanterns cast long shadows across the garden path as Wesley adjusted his journal and cleared his throat. The group sat in familiar silence, sharing sweets and stories, but something had shifted. He looked around the circle, fingers tracing his leather-bound notebook. His voice was low. "My father had a library," he began, careful and measured. "Not books you could see, but one that lived in his head." The firelight danced across his hands as he continued. "He told me stories while I was learning to read, and those stories were like seeds. Each one grew into something I could carry with me." He paused. "He had an old journal he never let me see, but I could smell it, like parchment and something else I can't name now. Something that meant home." His voice strengthened. "One night he gave me a piece of paper with 'Keep it safe' written in his script. It wasn't a story, just a note, but I kept it. Even after he was gone, even after my mother passed, I kept it, because it was a promise he made to me, and I carried it like a small light." His eyes glistened. "I never understood why he saved it, but now I know. He was telling me to always keep the stories, always remember the people who made me." His voice dropped to a whisper. "He made me a keeper of memory." Sophia's eyes followed his movements, softening. She had always felt Wesley carried stories like a vessel holding emotional truth. She reached into the basket beside her and pulled out a bowl of ladoo, each one perfectly rounded and golden. "Here," she said softly, offering one to each person. "These were made with love, and with the memory of those who came before us." The first bite brought a whisper of recognition. "They taste like my grandmother's kitchen," she said, and Sophia felt her heart flutter. "She used to make these for every holiday, and every bite reminded me of how safe I was." Sophia smiled, watching as the others took their first bites. One by one, the group fell into quiet appreciation, and she could see their own families, their own loved ones, in their expressions. As they ate, each sweet became a thread connecting them all, each bite a reminder of how stories and recipes were more than just ingredients. They were acts of love shared across time. Raya sat back, watching Wesley's face as he spoke. There was something about his voice, the way he held the memory of his father like a sacred object. She leaned forward slightly, her eyes bright but gentle. "You've given us something precious today," she said, her voice low and warm. "A story that lives inside the people who knew you. It's a gift to all of us, especially to those who remember and those who are learning to remember." Her words were soft, like a breeze through the garden. "We all carry the echoes of those who came before us," she continued. "And it is through stories like yours that we learn to hold them, to let them breathe, to let them become part of who we are." Raya's hands moved to her chest, and she smiled softly. "You gave us a memory. That's what stories do. And you gave us a piece of your heart." Vikram watched Wesley speak, admiring the quiet strength of those who could tell truth without grandeur. He pulled out his notebook, opening it to a fresh page, and began to write. His pen moved swiftly, capturing not just the words, but the way they felt. He had learned that stories needed to be preserved, not just told, and he felt deep respect for those who gave up their own stories so freely. His writing was deliberate, and he made a small note to follow up with Wesley after the gathering. There were stories to be recorded, moments to be preserved. He had seen how the garden transformed each evening, how each story brought the group closer together. As he wrote, he could hear the subtle sounds of the night around him, the hum of a tune, the rustle of a leaf, the gentle clink of a spoon against a bowl. his notebook filled with the echoes of the night, and he felt this was only the beginning. Amara had been sketching all evening, capturing the subtle movements of each person. Now, watching Wesley's face, she felt the need to draw on not just the external beauty of the scene, but the quiet power of emotion that filled the air. She pulled out her sketchbook and began to sketch the way Wesley held his hands, how his eyes softened with memory, and how his voice took on a quality that made her want to close her eyes and listen. The strokes of her pencil were gentle and precise, trying to capture the essence of the moment, the way it would be remembered in the future. Her pencil moved across the page as she watched the group, her eyes taking in the way the light from the lanterns played on their faces, the way their expressions changed with each story. The sketchbook was filling up with emotions, not just visual details, and she knew that these moments would be remembered long after the gathering ended. Her sketch of Wesley's face, captured in the soft glow of the lanterns, was a promise that these stories would not be forgotten. Rafaela's fingers found her guitar, and she hummed softly under her breath, her eyes closed as she felt the emotion of Wesley's story. She lifted her guitar, and the strings sang softly, a melody that matched the rhythm of his words. The notes were gentle, almost like a whisper, and they filled the air like a warm blanket. Wesley's eyes opened, and he studied her, surprised but touched. "That's exactly what I needed," he whispered, his voice full of emotion. The melody was simple, but it carried a depth that matched the weight of his words. It was like a bridge between the stories he had shared and the memories that connected them. The music was soft, and it filled the silence that had followed his story, and for a moment, everything in the garden felt whole. Rafaela's fingers moved over the strings with a gentle confidence, and she smiled as she felt the connection between her music and his words. It was as if they were two parts of the same story, and now they had found their harmony. Zainab sat quietly, her hands folded neatly in her lap, watching the others. She had always been more comfortable observing than participating, but even she could feel the quiet shift in the air. She studied the others, noting how their expressions had changed, how the evening had transformed from a simple gathering into something deeper. Her eyes moved from face to face, scanning their reactions. She had seen many gatherings, many moments of connection, but this one felt different. There was something about the way Wesley had spoken, how the others had responded, that made her feel a pull she couldn't ignore. She was used to keeping her distance, but now she found herself wanting to be closer, to understand what it meant to be part of something that felt like a family. Her eyes, however, remained cool and calculating, observing the scene with her usual precision, and she made a note in her head to pay attention to how the evening would play out in the days to come. Sanaa was quiet, her eyes fixed on Sophia as she watched the other woman's face light up when she offered the laddu. The warmth in Sophia's smile, the way she held the bowl like it was something precious, made her feel something she hadn't felt in a long time: sincere gratitude. She looked down at her hands, fingers curling slightly as she held her cup. She had always been careful not to burden others, but tonight Sophia had given her something more than just food. She had given her a memory, a sense of being seen. She took a small bite of the laddu and felt the sweetness spread across her tongue, like a memory of something kind, something warm. And when she looked up, her voice was soft but sincere. "Thank you," she said, her eyes meeting Sophia's, "for everything you've shared with us tonight, for making us feel welcome, for sharing your heart through your cooking." Sophia's eyes widened, and she reached out to touch Sanaa's hand briefly, her smile genuine. "You're welcome," she said simply, and Sanaa nodded, feeling a weight lift from her chest. It was small, but it meant everything. The group sat in silence for a moment, the weight of shared memory filling the air like a gentle fog. The soft sounds of the night rustling leaves, distant birds, added to the sense of peace. Each person sat a little closer, their eyes meeting with an unspoken understanding. It was as if the evening had become something sacred, a moment of connection that no one wanted to break. Wesley looked around at the faces of those who had shared this moment with him, and he felt his chest tighten with emotion. He had expected his story to be received well, but the way everyone had responded, how they had all seemed to find a part of themselves in it, made him realize how deeply these stories mattered. The garden around them was quiet, and the lanterns seemed to glow a little brighter, as if acknowledging the bond that had formed between them. They had all taken a piece of each other, and now they were a little more connected, a little more whole. Raya closed her eyes, and a gentle smile spread across her face. She was remembering how stories had healed her too, how the memories they carried could be both a burden and a gift. She had lived through many seasons, many changes, and she had learned to carry the stories of others with care, to make sure they were honored and not forgotten. The weight of memory was not something to be borne alone, but shared. And as she sat there, surrounded by people who had chosen to share their hearts, she felt a deep sense of peace. She opened her eyes, and her gaze settled on the garden, the way the stars began to appear in the sky. "We carry each other's stories," she whispered, and the group nodded, understanding her words. "And they become ours." The circle forms. The garden was still warm from the day's light, and the air held that particular quiet that comes before dusk settles in. Vikram moved with slow precision, arranging the chairs in a loose semicircle around the stone table where Sophia had already laid out a tray of small, steaming dishes. Each chair was positioned with care, the way he'd learned from his grandmother to ensure no one felt forgotten or left out. Wesley, still holding his journal, stood in the doorway watching. The weight of the past evening's sharing pressed against him, the memory of Raya's whispered words still humming in his chest like a lullaby. The moon's children, she'd said, and he'd felt it, something ancient and tender in the air between them. He had not been the only one who felt it, and yet he had never been quite sure how to hold that feeling, how to make it real. As if sensing his hesitation, Raya's voice drifted over, light and soft. "Would you like to hear a story from the land of my youth? Something that might tie us more closely together?" Wesley turned his head to look at her, his journal tucked under his arm. Her eyes held a kind of gentle challenge, as if she were asking not for a story, but for a choice. "Of course, Raya," he said, his voice catching slightly. "I would love to hear it." The words came out carefully, like he was trying to find a way into a world he'd never really entered. But he paused, his fingers tightening on the journal. "It's not just about the story. It's about the way we're all listening, the way we're all here." The soft clink of the ceramic tray in Sophia's hands seemed to echo his own thoughts, and he felt a warmth that had nothing to do with the food or the evening. "Tell us," he added, his smile small but genuine. Raya's gaze fell to her hands, which were folded neatly on her lap. "There's a tradition, a story that my grandmother used to tell me when I was young. She said the stars were the guardians of memory, and they watched over all those who would not be forgotten. One of the first stories I ever learned was about the moon's children, the ones who lived in the trees and watched over the gardens at night. They would come down, they said, to help the people who were lost, those who needed to remember how to love again." Her voice was low, and the garden was quiet enough that each word seemed to resonate. "She told me that if you listen carefully, you might hear their voices, whispering in the wind or the rustling of leaves. But it takes more than just listening. It takes the courage to believe in something beautiful." She paused, and then her eyes met his. "So I thought, since we're all here, maybe it's time we all begin to listen." Wesley felt the weight of her words settle in his chest, and he looked around at the others. Sophia was holding a small ladle, her movements graceful and deliberate. Amara had her sketchbook open, and she was drawing the way the light filtered through the trees. Rafaela sat with her guitar in her lap, her fingers brushing lightly over the strings. Zainab, ever the observer, was looking at them with quiet interest, her eyes never leaving the group. Sanaa was seated at the edge, her fingers lightly curled around a small charm, a gift she had made for the evening. The circle was forming, but it felt deeper than just physical space. It was an embrace of memory, of shared experience. "I'd like to tell you about my grandmother, too," Sophia said, her voice now warm and rich like the coffee she'd poured for everyone. "She came from the mountains, but she brought with her a legacy of food and stories. When I was little, she would cook for the whole village, and the smell of her cooking would reach the rooftops. She used to say that food was memory, and that it would carry the people who loved you beyond the grave." She paused, her eyes distant. There was a particular dish that she made for the spring festivals. It was called the Garden's Kiss, and it was a kind of sweet that was made with the flowers that bloomed in the garden. I don't know if any of you have ever tasted it, but I remember that the first bite always made me feel like I was part of something bigger, something that connected us all. She said that the garden was a kind of memory palace, and that it would hold us in its embrace if we were careful. And I believe that, because I've felt it too. As Sophia spoke, the others leaned in, the soft sounds of the garden surrounding them like a lullaby. The wind moved through the leaves, and the scent of night bloom scent drifted on the air. Wesley felt his journal slide from his hands, forgotten, and he smiled as he listened. He didn't need to write it down anymore. The story was already alive in the air between them. He studied Raya, who gave him a nod and a gentle smile. "It's like the garden remembers everything," she said, and he nodded, feeling the truth of it in his chest. Amara continued sketching, her pencil moving softly across the page. The scene was painted in gentle lines and soft curves. Rafaela was humming a melody, a quiet tune that seemed to come from her heart. Zainab still watched, but her expression had softened. "What did you think about the stories we've been sharing?" she asked, her voice quiet but firm. "I think they've helped us connect in a way that feels real." She looked around the group, her eyes steady and thoughtful. "We are all trying to find a place, to be accepted, to belong. And maybe we found that place here." Sanaa stepped forward, her hand extended, offering a small charm made from thread and beads, its edges carefully knotted. "This is for you," she said, her voice soft but sure. "It's a small gift, but I wanted to give something that might help us remember." The charm was delicate and warm, and she held it up so that it caught the light. "I made it for you, Raya, for the stories you shared with us." Raya's eyes widened, and she smiled. "I don't know what to say," she whispered, and the group laughed softly, a sound like rustling leaves. Wesley felt his heart flutter. He looked around the circle again, at all the faces, and realized that the garden was more than just a place. It was a sanctuary, a space where stories became truths and truths became memory. "I think we found something here," Sophia said, her voice gentle and clear, "a way to remember." As the first stars appeared, the circle grew tighter, and Wesley felt the weight of belonging settle on his shoulders like a soft blanket. "I think we're going to be okay," he said, and everyone nodded, their eyes reflecting the quiet magic of the night. The garden was still, and the world outside had faded into the background. They were here, in this space, this moment, this shared story, and it was enough. The chairs formed a perfect circle, mirroring the moonlight and the soft sounds of the garden. Wesley placed his journal down and smiled. He felt a deep peace settle in his chest, like a stone that had finally found its place. "This is what I was looking for," he whispered, "a way to be remembered." Vikram adjusted the seating once more, ensuring no one was left out, and Raya nodded slowly, her eyes closed, listening to the sound of their breaths and the quiet laughter of the garden. "It's here," she said. "It's always been here." And they all felt it, a quiet, sure embrace that held them all in its gentle circle, and for now, that was enough. The evening's embrace. The garden was quiet, the kind of stillness that felt like a held breath. The evening had settled into something sacred, the air thick with the scent of night-blooming flowers. Wesley sat cross-legged on the moss-covered stone bench, journal open on his lap, fingers tracing the smooth edge of the page. His eyes were closed, listening to the soft rustle of leaves above and the distant hum of cicadas. Then he heard it, a low, melodic sound that seemed to emerge from the earth itself. Rafaela was playing her guitar, the gentle strumming weaving through the twilight like a lullaby. Vikram had positioned himself just outside the circle, hands folded in his lap, watching with a soft smile. He'd orchestrated this gathering, reached out to each person individually, laid out the arrangements that allowed them to be here. Sophia brought her grandmother's old teacups, delicate and hand-painted, each one unique, each one holding stories. She moved them carefully between the plates, arranging them like a choreographed dance. The warmth of her hands lingered on the ceramic, and Wesley thought of his mother's kitchen, how she'd always kept a small bowl of sugar beside the stove, ready for guests. Amara was sketching, her pencil moving swiftly across paper, capturing the subtle curve of Sophia's smile, the way Raya's eyes lit up when she spoke. The sketchbook lay open on her lap, and she didn't seem to mind if someone looked. There was something about Amara's way of seeing that made it feel like she was giving permission to be seen. Zainab, sitting on the far edge, watched with careful attention, rarely letting herself be drawn in. Her hands were folded, quiet but sharp. She'd been quiet all evening, mostly observing, but now she was beginning to understand this wasn't just a gathering, it was something deeper. Raya was still telling her story, and the group leaned in, the lantern light casting long shadows. Her voice echoed in the air like wind through trees. "There was a time when the moon was young," she said, and her voice took on a musical quality that made everyone stop and listen. It had no name, no purpose. It simply hung in the sky, a cold, gray orb, watching the world below with no interest. But then came the children. Wesley felt his breath catch. He knew the story, of course. His grandmother had told it to him as a child, comforting. The idea of a moon with children, like a guardian watching over the sleeping world. But this was different. This was Raya's version, the one she'd added to over the years, making it more real, more personal. The children were not whimsical, but guardians, keepers of dreams, whispering secrets in sleeping children. And one of them, the smallest, the most stubborn, had grown tired of always being overlooked. The little moon child, Raya continued, had seen how the world was full of pain and sorrow, how people cried out in the night without knowing they were loved. So the little moon child decided that it would take on a task, a purpose. Silence filled the circle, broken only by the rustle of leaves and the call of a night bird. Wesley felt a strange warmth in his chest, like a small flame lighting up in the dark. The story had come alive in his mind, and he could see the little moon child, small and bright, making its way through the night sky, helping those who needed it most. Raya's voice grew softer, more intimate. The moon child was not afraid. It understood that love was not something that could be taken, but something that could be shared. And in sharing it, it became more than it had ever been. It became the light that made people feel safe, the warmth that made them believe. Tears were in her eyes now, and Sophia reached out and gently placed her hand over Raya's. "You've always been such a storyteller," Sophia whispered. Raya nodded, her eyes bright. "I've been trying to tell them all this time," she said softly, "but I never knew how to say it right." Wesley felt his heart beat faster, and he looked around the faces of the people in the circle. They were all listening, truly listening, and he realized they had all been waiting for something like this. Something to remind them of what they'd forgotten. "I have a story too," Wesley said, voice quiet but strong. "I don't know if it's the same kind of story, but it's one I've been trying to tell for a long time." He closed his eyes, took a deep breath, and when he opened them, he was ready. "There was a time in my life when I thought I had everything figured out. I was a storyteller, yes, but not a listener. I would sit in my little corner, writing down stories, thinking I understood them. But then I met someone who made me realize that stories aren't about having the right words. They're about having the courage to share the truth." His voice was barely above a whisper, but the circle was still, completely still. He felt their attention on him, and his hands trembled slightly as he held the journal, pages filled with stories he'd never shared with anyone. "There was a man I knew," he continued, his voice taking on a slight accent from his homeland, "who once said that the stories we tell are the ones we need to hear. He had a way of seeing things that made everything seem possible. He told me that to truly live, you have to be willing to listen." He paused, and the silence stretched out, thick with emotion. Wesley felt his chest tighten. He looked around the circle, seeing each face, each expression, and knew they understood. They'd all been waiting for someone to say what he was saying, to find the courage to share. "The man died a long time ago," Wesley said, voice now softer, more reflective. "But his words still live on in me. And that's why I'm here. Not because I have all the answers, but because I'm learning to ask the right questions." There was a long silence after that, and everyone seemed to be holding their breath, waiting for something more. Wesley felt a strange sense of relief, as if he'd just released something that had been trapped inside him for years. Vikram, who had been quietly watching, leaned forward and placed his hand gently on Wesley's shoulder. "You've found your voice," he said simply, his voice carrying a tone of quiet confidence. "And that's a gift." Wesley nodded, tears in his own eyes. He felt the warmth of the circle around him, the shared understanding that they were all here, all trying, all learning. Amara looked up from her sketchbook, her eyes soft, and quietly said, "Your story made me feel like I was there, like I was part of it." She handed the sketchbook to Sophia, who looked at it with surprise, then smiled. "It's beautiful," she whispered, and her voice carried the warmth of a person who truly understood. Rafaela began to strum again, and the melody that emerged was soft and gentle, like a gentle embrace. The sound filled the garden, wrapping itself around the group like a blanket. The scent of night-blooming flowers drifted through the air, and Wesley felt his heart swell with a feeling he hadn't known he was missing. Zainab, who had been quiet the whole time, finally spoke, her voice calm but intimate. "I've never seen anything like this." Sanaa looked up, her face softening. "We're all here," she said softly. "We're all part of this." The sound of Rafaela's guitar had become a gentle lullaby, and the garden seemed to pulse with a quiet rhythm. Wesley felt the weight of belonging settle on his shoulders like a warm blanket. The night was still, and the stars were beginning to appear, but everything felt right. And then, in that moment, Raya smiled, and her voice was like the softest whisper of the wind. "This is what home feels like when we hold each other." Wesley looked around the circle, at the faces of the people he'd come to know, to care for, to trust. They were all here, and he was finally home. But as the last word faded into the air, a soft rustling came from the edge of the garden, and Wesley's eyes widened. Something was moving in the shadows, something that hadn't been there before. "Who's there?" he asked, his voice rising with alarm. And from the darkness, a voice low and familiar answered, "The story isn't over yet." Melodies of memory. The scent of cardamom and cinnamon drifted through the garden like a whisper from memory. Sophia stood beside the table where she'd arranged her grandmother's recipes, her hands trembling slightly as she pulled out a yellowed page. The edges were curled, the ink faded, but the words were still legible. "For the day you remember," her grandmother had written, "cook with love, and the stories will follow." She held the paper to her chest, eyes closed, breathing in the familiar warmth. "When I was 7, I tried to make this dish papri chaat, but I was so eager to please that I used too much sugar, and the whole thing turned into a sticky mess." My mother laughed and said, "The secret isn't in the sugar, Mija, but in the heart." She made it again, and this time she taught me how to taste it and adjust it. I've been perfecting that recipe ever since. Her voice was low, filled with the texture of a moment that had been held like a treasured thing. "I always make it when I miss home." The others looked at her with curiosity and warmth, as if they were hearing her story for the first time. Sophia smiled, and her eyes sparkled like a woman who had found her way back to something she'd lost. Raya leaned forward in her chair, a gentle smile spreading across her face. "My father once told me a tale about the moon's children," she began, her voice smooth as honey. "But the real story is about how he would climb up onto the roof and watch the stars at night, pretending he was one of them. He had this way of making ordinary things magical, turning the silences between the stars into stories." She paused, her fingers tracing the edge of her shawl. "One night he brought me a cup of tea and told me that the moon's children were the ones who brought dreams to people's hearts, and that he would be waiting in the garden for them, like a gentle guardian." The group fell into a comfortable silence, the sound of her words wrapping around them like a soft blanket. "He was always the one who made sure we felt safe in the world." There was laughter in her voice now, a memory bright with affection. The moon's children would come to visit, and we'd all sit in the garden together, watching the stars and telling stories. Raya's eyes glistened, and she studied each person in the circle, her smile growing wider. Wesley's hand hovered over his journal, his eyes fixed on the table. "When I told the story about the man who died, I thought it was about loss," he said quietly, his voice barely above a whisper. "But now I realize it was about memory, about holding on to what mattered, even when the world changes." His fingers traced the spine of his notebook, as if searching for something else. "My grandmother used to tell me that stories were not just for remembering, but for connecting to the past and to the future. She'd say, 'The words you speak will outlive you, but the stories you live will define your journey.' I used to think she was just being poetic, but now I see that she was teaching me how to be part of something bigger." His voice became a little softer, more intimate. "The story isn't over yet, but we're all here, and that's enough." The others nodded, and the silence that followed was filled with a sense of shared understanding. Vikram smiled, his face softening with a quiet joy. "I've been listening to you all this evening, and I've seen how these stories have brought us together," he said gently. "It's like we're all part of one great tapestry, each thread a memory, each color a feeling. The garden has been our loom, and you've all been weaving something beautiful." He glanced around the circle, his eyes gentle. "Every time we gather, we're not just sharing stories, we're building a new kind of family, one that's made up of trust, laughter, and a deep respect for what we've shared." His voice carried a quiet strength. "We're not alone, we're not forgotten, we're here, and we're becoming something more." The group responded with quiet agreement, the air thickening with the weight of what had been said. Amara lifted her sketchbook, the pages filled with drawings of the group, each face caught in a moment of peace and joy. "This is the kind of thing I've been trying to capture," she said softly. "Every drawing is like a small memory, a way of preserving what we are right now." She turned the pages carefully, showing each person in their own unique pose. "It's hard to capture the feeling of connection, but I think it's there, in the way they look at each other, in the way the light falls across their faces." She smiled at Sophia, whose hands were still resting on the recipe. "This is how I want to remember this moment." The others leaned in to look, the sketches seeming to breathe with life. "I hope it will stay with us." The drawing of Wesley, eyes closed and smiling, was especially poignant, as if he were truly holding the story in his heart. Rafaela's fingers danced along the strings, her melody rising and falling like a gentle stream. The notes were soft, but they held a deep significance, like the sound of a heart beating in time with the world. The tune was familiar yet new, and as it played, the group fell into a kind of trance, the world around them melting away. The scent of night bloom scent and the rustle of leaves filled the air, and it felt like the garden itself was breathing with them. "Music is like a story," she whispered, her fingers dancing across the strings. "It tells us how we feel, even when we can't say it out loud." Her voice was low, melodious, and full of feeling. "When stories are shared, we are never truly alone." The melody swelled, wrapping around the group like a warm embrace. "It's not just about what we hear, it's about what we feel." The sounds seemed to fill the garden with a sense of peace, a gentle rhythm that carried them forward. Zainab sat quietly, her eyes fixed on the moon rising in the distance. Her notebook was open, and she had a pen in her hand, adding a few notes to the calendar she'd been keeping. The lines were neat, precise, and the entries were brief, but meaningful. "I've been thinking about the garden," she said, her voice calm and controlled. "It's interesting. There's a rhythm here that I hadn't expected. I don't know what I expected, but it's not what I thought. I've been working on a few things, but it's hard to stay focused when there's so much going on around me." Her fingers moved across the paper, adding a few more items. "I've made a note about the next meeting, and I've added a few details about the garden's layout. It's helpful to have a plan, even if it's not something I need to follow exactly." She looked up at the others with a slight smile, her voice steady. "I can't say I understand it all, but it's been a pleasant surprise." The calendar was neatly organized, and her handwriting was crisp and clear, a sharp contrast to the softness of the evening. Sanaa's voice was barely a whisper, but it carried the weight of a moment that had been long in coming. "My mother used to say that the stories we tell ourselves are the ones that help us heal," she said, her voice soft and steady. "When I was younger, I thought I was broken, but she taught me that we all carry pieces of ourselves that need to be put back together. It's not easy, but it's worth it." She smiled gently, a small but powerful expression. "I've been learning to trust again, and I've been trying to be more open. I've been thinking about how we're all here, all learning together. I want to be part of this, and I want to be part of something that's bigger than myself." Her words were simple, but they carried the strength of a person who had found her way back to herself. "I hope I can contribute to this space, too." The others nodded, and Sanaa's smile grew, a quiet joy lighting up her face. The melody continued, and the evening stretched on like a long, gentle breath. The garden was full of light, and the stars were beginning to twinkle in the sky. Wesley hummed a low note, his voice joining Rafaela's melody like a gentle echo. "It's like the garden is breathing with us," he said softly. "The stories we shared are like the heartbeat of this place, and we're all part of that rhythm." Raya's eyes closed, and she smiled, her hands gently resting on her knees. The group sat in quiet contemplation, surrounded by the gentle sound of music and memory, the world holding its breath in the space between one story and the next. When stories are shared, we are never truly alone. Rafaela's voice floated on the air like a prayer, soft and full of meaning. The garden had become a sanctuary, a space where stories could live, and where they could all find their way home. The garden was silent, save for the sound of the wind and the low hum of the melodies. Each person sat in their own corner of the moment, but all were connected by the invisible thread of shared understanding. The evening was full of peace, and the air was thick with the feeling of being truly seen. The stars were bright, and the garden was alive with the quiet energy of a moment that had become a memory. Wesley looked around the circle, his heart full. "We've come so far," he whispered, his voice barely audible. "We're all here, and we're all part of something bigger than what we thought we were." The others nodded, their faces calm and peaceful. "It's like we've found a home, but it's not a place, it's a feeling of connection, of being understood, of being held." He smiled, and his eyes sparkled with a quiet joy. "This is what I've been looking for." The garden was filled with a sense of belonging, and the memories of the evening would stay with them like a gentle shadow, always there, always warm. Raya closed her eyes, her smile growing wider. "The story isn't over yet," she whispered, and the words seemed to echo in the garden. "But we're ready for whatever comes next." The others settled into the quiet, the music continuing to fill the air like a soft blanket. They had found their rhythm, their voices, and their place in the world. The garden would always hold them, and they would always return to it no matter where life took them. As the last notes of Rafaela's melody faded into the air, the group sat in comfortable silence, their hands touching, their eyes meeting, their hearts beating in harmony. The garden was full of peace, and they had all found a way to belong. The stories had been shared, and the memories would live on, and somewhere in the shadows, the mysterious voice echoed one last time, as if to remind them that the story was never really finished. The garden would keep them, and they would keep each other. The moon was high, and the stars were bright, and the garden was full of life. The quiet strength. The garden was silent except for the rustle of leaves and the distant chime of a water clock. Wesley's journal lay open on the low stone table, his pencil hovering over the page like it might write itself. The scent of night bloom drifted in from the corner where Raya had placed a small vase of night bloom scent and moonflower. Amara sat across from him, her sketchbook open on her lap, the pencil she'd been holding now tucked behind her ear. She looked up at him with quiet intensity, her dark eyes bright with something that might have been pride or maybe just relief. "You should see what I drew," she said, her voice soft but steady. Wesley turned his gaze from the page to meet hers, his mouth opening slightly as if he wasn't sure how to respond. "It's beautiful," he said finally, and Amara smiled, but it was a smile that held something deeper, something like a beginning. "I drew the way the light caught in your eyes when you were telling that story about the old banyan tree. It's like you were painting with your voice." Wesley's fingers tightened on the pencil, his gaze flickering to the page again, where he'd been scribbling notes about the way the garden felt that evening, the way everyone had seemed to breathe together. He hadn't meant to write it down, didn't even realize he'd been doing it until now. But seeing Amara's sketch, the way it captured him in that moment, made his chest ache. It was like she'd found a thread he hadn't even known he'd been holding. "I didn't mean to be so." He paused, searching for a word that didn't sound too sentimental, so visible. Amara shook her head, her smile growing. "It's not about visibility, Wesley. It's about being seen. And you've always seen the stories in the small things, haven't you?" He didn't answer immediately. Instead, he looked down at the page, the notes he'd scribbled in his hurried hand, the way light made the garden hum with memory, the weight of the silence between words, the way Raya's voice pulled us all back to the same breath. She watched him, her eyes soft but knowing. "That's what we're all doing here, isn't it? Trying to remember what matters?" Wesley took a breath, and the way he held it, the way his shoulders relaxed, was like a small surrender. He closed the journal, his fingers lingering on the cover for a moment before placing it on the table. "Maybe we're not just remembering," he said, his voice quieter now. "Maybe we're making something new." The night air was cool, the stars beginning to pierce through the canopy of the trees. Sophia had moved to the far edge of the garden, arranging the last of the sweets on a tray. She smiled at them from across the space, her hands still slightly dusted with flour from her own cooking. The scent of cardamom and rose petals hung in the air, a familiar comfort. Amara turned back to her sketchbook, her fingers tracing the lines of the drawing with a delicate tenderness. "It's not just about the sketch," she said softly. "It's about the way you felt that night, how you were listening, how we all were." Wesley nodded, but he didn't say anything more. Instead, he fixed on the garden around them, the way the shadows formed patterns on the stone paths, the way light and dark seemed to dance in the air. It was quiet, but not empty. Raya's voice drifted from the far corner where she sat, her fingers lightly tapping a rhythm against the table. "The moon has a story for every one of us," she said, her voice like water in the wind. "And we are all the moon's children, no matter where we came from." They all turned toward her, and Wesley felt something shift in the air. It was like she'd drawn them in, made them all part of a larger thread. He watched Sophia, who smiled, and at Amara, who was now closing her sketchbook with a soft snap. Vikram had moved closer, his hands clasped together, his face calm but thoughtful. "We are all learning to be part of something bigger," he said. "And that's not always easy, but it's necessary." Sanaa sat in the corner, her hands folded in her lap, a quiet smile on her face. She had been silent for most of the evening, but now her voice came softly, carefully. "I've been thinking about my journey here," she said, her eyes meeting each of theirs in turn. "I came with nothing but a suitcase and a prayer. I've walked through so many places, so many stories, and now I feel like I'm finally home. Not because I found a place, but because I found a way to belong." There was a silence in the garden, and everyone looked at Sanaa, a little surprised by the vulnerability in her words. Wesley watched her, his heart swelling slightly. There was something in her voice, a quiet strength that made him think of how far she'd come. Zainab had not spoken yet, but she was watching, her head tilted just slightly, as if she were listening to something more than words. She wasn't usually one for sharing, but she'd been quiet and attentive throughout the evening, even when others had taken up the stories. Now, she finally spoke, her voice calm and composed. "I've been thinking about what it means to be here," she said. "I didn't come looking for community. I came for space, for quiet. But it seems that's not enough. I'm starting to see that I'm not just in this place, I'm part of it." Sophia looked up, her eyes warm. "It's not about being quiet or loud, Zainab. It's about being real." Zainab nodded slowly. "I think I understand now. I don't have to be someone else to be part of this. I just have to be myself." The silence that followed was filled with a quiet recognition, a shared understanding that everyone at the table had grown in their own way. Raya's voice came again, low and warm. "The story isn't over yet," she said. "We are still writing it, still becoming." Wesley turned to look at the others, his mind full of the way they'd all shifted in the last hour, how they'd all opened up a little more. He studied the sketch in Amara's hands, and then at Sophia's face, still smiling. He opened his journal again, this time writing not just notes, but a memory of the moment, of the way the garden had felt, the way everyone had been together. "I think I understand now," he said softly. "When we remember, we build the future together." Rafaela hummed, a gentle melody that floated through the air, and everyone else hummed along, quietly, like a shared heartbeat. The night was full of the quiet strength of connection, of being part of something larger than themselves. The garden was full, and the stars were bright. They were not alone, and they were not forgotten. The scent of night bloom drifted in again, and this time it felt like a promise. Wesley looked at Sophia again, and she smiled at him, a quiet, knowing smile. They didn't need words. They had already been understood. Zainab pulled out a small notebook, her pen moving across the page, writing in careful, deliberate strokes. It wasn't a story, not yet, but it was a note, a small beginning. Raya's voice was soft but certain. "When we remember, we build the future together." The garden breathed with them, full of stories that were just beginning. The last petal. The garden held its breath after the last story was told, the final whisper of Raya's voice fading into the warm dusk. Wesley's journal lay open on the table, its pages still bearing the memory of his words, now smoothed and touched by fingers that had moved through the evening's quiet intimacy. The last light of day caught the curve of his spine, the soft curve of his mouth, the way his eyes stayed fixed on the book, as if the words might leap from the page again. He was holding it differently now, not clutching it, but holding it as something to be shared. Sophia had placed a small dish of ladoos in the center of the table, each one a perfect round, their sweetness still warm from her careful touch. The scent of cardamom and sugar rose gently with the evening breeze, a quiet promise that food, like stories, could carry the warmth of memory. She fixed on the others, her hands resting lightly on her hips, her heart full of a quiet pride. It had been a good evening. It had been a beginning. Raya's fingers were still curled around the edge of the table, her palms soft and calm, her breathing slow and deep. Her eyes, closed now, were pressed tight with the memory of their faces, of the way they had all leaned in, all listened. She had heard the story of the moon's children, and she had shared her own. The evening had brought them together, not just as neighbors, but as something more, something real. Vikram stood by the garden's edge, his hand gently resting on Amara's shoulder. She was still sketching, her pen moving in quiet rhythm over the page, but she looked up at him with surprise. He didn't say anything, just held his hand there, steady, warm, and knowing. Amara smiled softly, her eyes brightening slightly, and she looked back down at the paper with renewed purpose. Rafaela's guitar was in her lap, the strings silent now. She had played her final melody, a soft tune that drifted across the garden like the scent of night bloom scent, and the notes had lingered in the air, like memories not yet fully formed. Her fingers traced the strings once, gently, and then she closed her eyes, letting the silence of the evening settle around her. A gentle hum escaped her lips, soft, like a prayer. Zainab folded her notebook with deliberate care, each fold precise and deliberate. Her expression had changed, not in appearance, but in the way she carried herself now. The weight of the evening was not something she had tried to avoid, but rather something she had come to embrace. She watched the others, and there was a smile there, small but real. It was a beginning, and she was no longer afraid to be part of it. Sanaya knelt beside the garden's edge, her hands gently pressed together. She whispered a small blessing, the words soft and uncertain but sincere, a quiet offering to the garden that had welcomed them all. The words were carried on the wind, fading into the dusk, but the feeling of gratitude remained. A single petal, one of the last night bloom petals, drifted down from the sky. It landed gently on the small table where the dishes had been set, catching the last rays of sunlight and catching the attention of everyone present. The light that touched it seemed to glow, as if the petal itself was alive with memory. It was a small thing, but it felt like a promise. Wesley closed the journal and looked up. His voice was quiet, but steady. "I think we'll meet again tomorrow," he said, as if the words had been whispered by the wind itself. Sophia smiled, and her eyes brightened with the hope of tomorrow's stories. She studied the others, and her heart felt full, like the warmth of the sun after a long evening. They had made something real here, and it would not be forgotten. Raya's eyes opened slowly. Her voice was soft, but it carried the weight of a promise. "Tomorrow we begin again." And in the garden, where stories are told and memories are held, the last petal settled into the quiet, and the last light of day faded into the next, as if the world itself was waiting for them to return. It was the end of one thing, and the beginning of another. But not the end of the story, just the end of one chapter and the promise of more to come. The night bloom petal sat on the table, golden and still, as if waiting for someone to take it, to carry it forward. And as the garden grew quiet and the stars began to emerge, the group of neighbors, now friends, began to drift away. But they were not alone. The garden held them, and they held it. In the next morning they would gather again, as they always did, because the garden was not just a place, it was a home. Sophia tucked her hand into Wesley's as they walked. He glanced at her and smiled, and the warmth of their connection was enough to light the way. The garden was quiet now, but it would not be empty. The stories had just begun. The night bloom petal lay on the table, still but full of promise. It was not the last one, and the last one would be the first of many. Wesley turned back one last time, and the garden looked back at him, full of the memory of their shared evening. They would return tomorrow or the next day or the day after. Because the garden was not just a place, it was a space where hearts could find their way home. And the next time they gathered, they would have a new story to tell, a new memory to hold. The petal was not just a petal. It was a sign of continuity, of return, of the gentle embrace of the garden. The garden held them, and they, in turn, would hold it. The last petal, the first memory, the beginning of a new chapter. And the garden waited. Wesley's journal sat closed on the table, its pages filled with the quiet echoes of the evening. He knew he would return to it, not just to write, but to remember, to hold the stories in his heart and to pass them forward, like the gentle breath of wind through the garden. The petal stayed on the table, golden and still, until the next morning. The garden was quiet, but it was full of the promise of tomorrow. And the next morning they would gather again. Because that was what they did, they gathered, they told stories, they remembered. And the garden, in its quiet way, would hold them all, every time. It was not about endings, it was about beginnings, and the way stories carry on, even after the last word is spoken. The garden had embraced them, and they had embraced it. And in that embrace, they had found something deeper than community, something more than friendship. They had found home. The petal remained, and the garden, ever patient, waited. Tomorrow would come, and tomorrow they would begin again.